Welcome to the Build Your Private Practice podcast, a space for Canadian therapists who want to support others, make an impact, and build a sustainable practice that works for them too. I'm your host, Liane Wood, a registered psychotherapist, group practice owner, and business mentor, and I'm here to help you build a private practice that allows you to keep doing the work you love without burning out. Because the people who need your help the most are counting on you, and you deserve a practice that supports you while you support them. Let's dive in. Here's what I wish someone had told me about starting a private practice. The systems you set up in your first 6 months will decide whether you grow steadily or burn out trying. Booking by email, tracking sessions in a spreadsheet, chasing payments, that's the path most practitioners regret. Jane is the practice management software that I point BYPP members to when they're setting up their first practice. Scheduling, charting, billing, and online payments all in one place. Built in Canada by people whose mission is to help the helpers. New to practice? Check out the new practice guide from Jane. Links are in the show notes below. Welcome back to the Build Your Private Practice podcast. I'm your host, Liane Wood, and this is the podcast for Canadian mental health practitioners who are ready to build a private practice that supports your life, not one that quietly drains you in the name of helping people. So here we are together today, just me and you, and a topic that came up in 3 different coaching calls this past week. Same hidden problem in each one, even though the practitioners didn't know each other and weren't talking about the same thing. 3 coaching calls this week, 3 different practices, 3 different therapists, and in each one of them, the same quiet problem sitting underneath the surface conversation. A problem none of them had named yet. The boundary had been set. Nobody had tested it. So let me tell you about the first one because it's the cleanest example. A therapist on a call told me very proudly that she had set a new policy in her practice. She does not reply to client emails on weekends. Saturday and Sunday are her own time for her partner, her kids, her body, her rest, and she'd written this down. She'd updated her email signature and she'd even drafted an autoresponder for her inbox. The whole thing was beautifully thought through. So I said, "Tell me what happens when a client emails you on a Saturday." She paused. And then she said, "It hasn't happened yet." I watched her face change a little as I said it because the second the words came out of her mouth, she heard them too. The policy was set, the autoresponder was drafted, the intention was clear, but no clients had emailed over the weekend since she put the policy in place, which meant she'd never actually had to do the thing she had decided she was going to do. The second therapist on my calendar this week had a similar setup. She had a 24-hour cancellation policy with a full session fee for late cancels. It was in her intake paperwork. Her clients had all signed off on it. The wording was clear. The fee was set. I asked her how many late cancellations she had charged the fee for in the last 6 months. She said I'd have to check. So we checked. The answer was 0. There had been late cancellations. There had been 6 of them in 6 months, but none of them had been charged. The third therapist had set a policy around session length. Her sessions were 50 minutes, hard stop. She even had told her clients this out loud in their first sessions, that she wraps up at the 50-minute mark to give herself the break she needs before her next client. Beautifully framed, beautifully communicated. I asked her how often her sessions actually end at 50 minutes. She thought about it for a moment. And then she said, honestly, maybe 2 times a week out of 17. 3 different boundaries in 3 different practices, all of them set with care, none of them tested, or, and this is the more honest version, tested over and over and quietly not held in ways nobody was tracking. And that is a texture of what came up this week. And it's so common that I want to spend the whole episode on it because if you've set a boundary in your practice and you have not actually had to defend it, or you have had to defend it and you've actually not held the line, then this episode is for you. Here's what I told the first therapist, the one with the weekend email policy. And it is the sentence that I want you to write down somewhere if you take only one thing from this episode. That is not a boundary. That is a plan. A boundary that has only existed inside your head or on paper or in your intake documents, but has never actually had to be defended, that's not a boundary yet. It's a sentence you have written down, a plan, an intention, a really lovely articulation of what you would like to be true in your practice. The boundary becomes a boundary the first time when someone presses against it and you hold the line. That is the moment, not when you set the policy, not when you put it in writing, and not when you tell your spouse or your therapist or your supervisor that you have a new rule for yourself. The moment is when the test arrives. The Saturday email, the late cancellation, the client who keeps going at minute 52, and you have to do the thing you said you were going to do. And here's the cruel part. The test rarely comes when you're ready for it. The test does not show up on a Wednesday morning, fresh and well rested, when you have just had a coffee and you are at your professional best. The test shows up at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday when your kid has a fever, or at 11 a.m. on a Sunday when you're trying to enjoy brunch, or in the last 3 minutes of a session with a client who has just started to cry. That is when the boundary becomes real or it doesn't, because every boundary lives in the gap between the version of you who set it, calm, well rested, and thinking clearly about what you need to keep yourself well, and the version of you who's being asked to defend it, tired in the middle of something with a real human in front of you who is asking you, often very kindly, to make an exception just this once. The version of you who set the boundary is not the same person as the version of you who has to hold it, and that is the gap most therapists fall into. So I want to name why this is so hard, specifically for us as a profession, because this is not a podcast about boundaries in the abstract. This is about boundaries inside a private practice run by someone whose entire professional training was about being accommodating, flexible, present, and attuned. You've spent years learning how to flex toward the person in front of you. You're trained to find a gentle workaround, the accommodation that makes the client feel met, the way to hold a difficult moment without making it harder, the clinical skill of saying yes with care to whatever the client needs from you in that session, in that moment, and on that day. That training is part of what makes you a good therapist. It is part of what your clients pay for, and it's part of why people trust you in the first session. They can feel that you are not going to be rigid, that you're not going to make them feel small, and you're not going to defend a rule at the expense of their humanity. That is the gift that you bring to the clinical hour. And it is also, when it bleeds into the business side of your practice, the thing that quietly costs you everything. Because the same instinct that makes you a good clinician in the room, the instinct to flex, to accommodate, to find the gentle workaround, is the instinct that says yes to the Saturday email. The same skill set that lets you sit with a client in a hard moment is the skill that has you waiving the cancellation fee because she sounded so distressed on the voicemail. The same care that makes your sessions feel safe and unhurried is the care that lets a 50-minute session stretch to 75 because she finally said the thing. The clinical instinct and the business need are pulling you in opposite directions. The clinical instinct says, meet her where she is. The business need says, hold the structure that lets you do this work for the next 20 years without burning out. And most of the time, when those two are in conflict in the moment, the clinical instinct wins because you've been trained for years to let it win. And that's not a flaw. That is what your training instilled in you. But it means that boundary setting inside your own practice is not a skill you got from your clinical work. It's a separate skill and it has to be built separately. So let me give you some concrete examples of what caving looks like, because I think part of the problem is that caving rarely feels like caving in the moment. It feels like care. It feels like flexibility. It feels like being a good therapist. It only looks like caving when you zoom out and see the pattern. Here are some of the ones I see the most often, and I want you to listen for the ones that sound like you're weak. The 24-hour cancellation fee that gets waived because the client called and sounded so distressed, or they had a really good reason, and you don't want to be the kind of therapist who charges someone. So you waive it once, and then twice. And then the next client cancels, and you waive that too. And 6 months later, the policy that exists in your paperwork, but it's never, ever been charged. The new client inquiry that comes in on Sunday morning and you reply within 15 minutes because it will only take a second, and you don't want her to think that nobody's home and you're right there with your coffee anyways. You've just trained that client to expect Sunday responses from you. You set a precedent that neither of you negotiated. The session that runs over because the client got vulnerable in the last 5 minutes and you cannot bring yourself to interrupt the moment to end on time. So you let it run to 57 minutes, to 63, to 75. And by the time you have made the time back from your transition break and your charting time, and you are starting the next session already behind, you're already a little dysregulated, already a little less present than you wanted to be. The waitlist email you draft and send at 11 p.m. because you were thinking about it anyway, and you want her to know she's been heard, and you don't want her to think you forgot. That email teaches the recipient that your inbox is open at 11 p.m. Future emails from that person will arrive at hours that match the hours your replies arrive. The quick question client email that you answer in detail on a Tuesday night because it'll only take a second. 25 minutes later, you've written what is functionally a session note in response to an email on a Tuesday night in your kitchen with your laptop balanced on the counter. The client didn't ask for 25 minutes of your unpaid time. You gave it because you could not figure out how to give less. The associate or supervisee who messages you on your day off and you reply within an hour because they've been waiting and you don't want to leave them stuck, and surely a quick voice note will not hurt anybody. The next day off, another message arrives and you reply again and the pattern sets. None of those caves is dramatic, not a single one. Each one is small, each one is humane, each one feels in the moment like the right call, and every single one of them is a quiet exception. And every quiet exception, as I'm about to explain, is a vote against the boundary holding next time. Here is what nobody tells you about quiet exceptions. They don't stay quiet. Every time you make an exception to a boundary you set, you are teaching 3 different parties what the real rules are. You're teaching the client, you're teaching yourself, and you are teaching the future version of yourself the next time the test comes. So let me unpack each of those. When you make an exception for a specific client, that client learns the actual policy of your practice, not the one in the intake paperwork, but the one that lives in the gap between your stated rules and your actual behavior. They learn that the cancellation fee is, in practice, optional. They learn that emails to you on weekends get responses. They learn that your 50-minute session is 50 minutes or longer if they need it. They're not being manipulative. They're being a normal human being who pays attention to what actually happens, not what is written down. You've set the new norm by your behavior, and they are operating inside that norm. So the next time they cancellate, they will not be braced to be charged for the fee, and they will be braced for the version of the relationship you've already taught them exists. That is the first vote. The second vote is the one you are casting against your own nervous system. Every time you cave, you reinforce the neural pathway that says defending the boundary creates friction, and friction is unsafe, and unsafe is bad. So the way to feel safe is to give in. Your body learns. The next time the test comes, the cave happens faster, more automatically, with less internal resistance. You will not even feel the moment of decision. You'll just notice after the fact that you replied to the email, or you waived the fee, or you let the session run over again. And the third vote is the cumulative one. The boundary is not just for this client, for this session, or for this email. It is for the structure of your whole practice. The next client who has late cancellation, the next inquiry that comes in on a Sunday, the next session that wants to stretch. All of those are downstream of the votes you've already cast. The boundary that gets exceptions for one client gets exceptions for the next one too. Not because you mean to, because you've already established the pattern. That pattern is the boundary now. The written policy is just a polite fiction. And here's the most painful part. After 6 months or a year of quiet exceptions, the boundary is not actually doing any work for you anymore. It exists on paper, but it doesn't exist in your life. You have all the cost of having set the policy, the awkwardness, the discomfort, the moments where you almost held the line and didn't, and none of the benefit because the policy is not actually protecting your time, your energy, or your nervous system from anything. So let me say something important because I don't want this episode to feel tough or cold or more punitive. Holding the line is not aggressive and it's not punitive. It's not unkind. It's not the opposite of being a good clinician. Some of the warmest, most attuned, most clinically gifted therapists I've ever met are also the ones who hold their boundaries most steadily. The two things are not in tension. They actually reinforce each other. Holding the line looks like a warm, brief, clear message that says, per our policy, the cancellation applies for cancellations within 24 hours. I've added it to your invoice. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. That's the whole thing. No apology, no explanation, no long paragraphs softening it. Warm, brief, clear. The boundary is held, the relationship is intact, and the client receives a small, useful piece of information about how the practice works. Holding the line looks like wrapping at 50 minutes with care. I want to honor what you've just brought into the room, so let's start there in our next session. Then the session ends on time. The vulnerable moment gets named and the work continues on schedule. Holding the line looks like an autoresponder on your weekend email that gently says, thanks for reaching out. I respond to messages Monday through Friday. If you're in crisis, here are the resources in your area. The client gets the boundary and the care, both at the same time. And here's the other thing I want to say. Holding the line does not mean you can never make an exception. You absolutely can. The difference is whether the exception is a conscious choice or a default cave. A conscious exception sounds like, she's had 4 sessions with me. This is her first cancellation. Her grandfather just died, and I am going to make a one-time exception. I'm noting this in her file. Next time, the policy applies. That's a decision. It's intentional, and it is in service of the relationship and the boundary, not against the boundary. A default cave sounds like, well, it doesn't sound like anything because there was no decision. You just waived the fee because you didn't know how not to. Every therapist I work with makes the occasional intentional exception. That's normal and it's human. It's part of running a real practice with real relationships. The difference is whether your behavior is the result of a decision or the result of avoidance. Boundaries that are held with intention can flex when there is a real reason to flex. Boundaries that have never been held cannot flex because there's nothing to flex from. They're just sentences. And sentences don't bend. They just sit there, decorative. And here's what I want to invite you into this week. I want you to pick one boundary that you've set in your practice. It can be the weekend email policy, the cancellation fee, the session length, the intake process, the waitlist response time, the way you handle requests from supervisees, the way you handle quick questions between sessions. Anything you've decided is going to be true about how your practice runs. And now ask yourself 2 questions out loud if it helps, or write them down somewhere only you will see. Question number 1. When was the last time that a boundary was actually tested? Not when you said it, not when you wrote it down, not when you told someone about it. When was the last time a real human in a real moment asked you, directly or indirectly, to make an exception and you had to decide whether to hold the line or cave? If your honest answer is never or I can't remember, that boundary is still a plan. You've not built the muscle yet. The first test when it comes is going to be hard. You are going to need to be ready. Question number 2 is, what will you actually do the first time it's tested? Not what would you like to do, not what do you intend to do. What will you say in real words when the email arrives at 11 a.m. on a Sunday? What will you write on the invoice when the late cancellation happens? What words will leave your mouth when the session hits minute 50 and the client is still mid-sentence? If you do not have an actual answer to that question, if you don't know the words you will use, the message you will send, the tone you'll hold, then you are not ready to hold the boundary when the test arrives, which means that right now, in a calm moment, with nothing on the line, this is the time to decide. Write the words, draft the email, practice the sentence, have it ready. The version of you who is calm and clear right now is the version that can prepare the version of you who is tired and pressed in the moment. That is the work, not the setting of the boundary, the deciding in advance of what you will do when the test arrives, because the test will arrive. The only question is whether you have prepared for it. Now, a few last things before I let you go. If this episode has landed for you, if you're sitting somewhere right now thinking about a boundary you set 6 months ago that has been quietly eroding in the background, I'd love to hear about it. You can email me or find me on Instagram and send me a DM. I read them all because I want to know what's happening in your practice this week. And if you know another therapist who's in a similar spot, the spot where the boundary exists in writing but not in life, please share this episode with them. The hardest part of holding a boundary is feeling like you're the only one struggling to hold it, and you're not. Forwarding this episode to a colleague who needs it is one of the kindest things you can do this week. If you are new to this podcast, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. The easiest way to make sure you do not miss a new episode is to hit subscribe or follow in whatever app you're listening in. New episodes come out every week. And before I go, one more thing, and I want to say it directly. A boundary you have set but never tested is not a failure. It's a starting point. The fact that you set it at all puts you ahead of where you were 6 months ago. And the next step is just the practice of actually defending it the first time it's asked of you. And the time after that, and the time after that. The boundary becomes real, one held line at a time, not one set policy at a time. You are allowed to hold your boundaries, and you're allowed to do it with warmth. You're allowed to make intentional exceptions when there is a real reason for one. And you're allowed to decide calmly right now what you will do the first time the next test arrives. Take care of yourself, take care of your practice, and I'll see you next Monday. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Build Your Private Practice podcast. If today's episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a fellow Canadian therapist who needs this. And remember, the work you do matters. Keep showing up, keep holding space, and keep building a practice that works for you. If you're looking for practical tools or support to grow your practice with more clarity and confidence, head to buildyourprivatepractice.ca. There's lots waiting for you there. I'll see you next time.